Welcome back to the London Futurists podcast. In this episode, we return to the subject of existential risks, but with a focus on what actions can be taken to eliminate or reduce these risks. Our guest is James Norris, who describes himself on his website as an existential safety advocate. The website lists 4 primary organisations which he leads: the International AI Governance Alliance, Upgradable, the Centre for Existential Safety, and Survival Sanctuaries. Previously, one of James's many successful initiatives was Effective Altruism Global, the international conference series for effective altruists. He also spent some time as the organiser of a kind of sibling organisation to London Futurists, namely Bay Area Futurists, and he graduated from the University of Texas at Austin with a triple major in psychology, sociology, and philosophy, as well as with minors in too many subjects to mention. James, welcome to the London Futurist podcast.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks for joining us, James.
James, how does one person manage to juggle so many different activities?
Very carefully or very chaotically. Take your pick. My background has been one of trying to do as much good as humanly possible since I was a kid. And so that was a driving force. What you've seen, that we've spoken about, these are just the reflection of trying to live by that purpose. And yeah, a lot of caffeine. That's one way to put it. But I'll admit, the last 10 years has been very different from the first 15, 20 years. So I'm in a different phase of life where I don't think my work is as relevant. It's more about the collective of humanity, what we choose to do with our remaining few years, or decades, hopefully, or centuries if we do it well. The mission statement of Center for Existential Safety is to help us survive this decade. So we're very focused on the short term at the moment.
As you said, there's not much we can do as individuals, but we as a collective, as a coordinated group around the world, can do a heck of a lot more.
Definitely.
Now, you do offer services via your initiative Upgradable, which aims to help people to use not just caffeine, but other emerging technologies, behavioral science, and applied rationality to help them, you say, set, plan, and achieve their most valuable life goals. How's that going?
Yeah, this is the bit of my life's work compressed into a single protocol to help you and me and everyone else optimize and achieve what we value the most. I'm pretty happy with some of the progress, but you have to imagine that if you're actually trying to upgrade from current state to a future state, to a post-human state, it does really require a lot of time and technology to compress that time. So we've done this with a few people. They spent hundreds of thousands of hours of their time focused on achieving what they value the most, and they've made some progress. But I don't think we've really got any superhuman type of folks yet. And that was expected. We have been waiting for AIs to come and facilitate this process for human development. And maybe they're here. So I expect at some point someone's going to run an upgrade program using AI and have it coach them or catalyze them every moment of every day, every week, every month, every year towards who they choose to be. Because right now, humans, we're not so fantastic at staying on point on the things we value. We get distracted pretty easily, and it's overwhelming to actually do these things. Just for context for listeners, we have 42 different life areas: appearance, behavioral, cognition, relationships, sex, transportation, everything in between. So life is extremely complicated in our century. But if you were trying to flourish in a small tribe where your main choice was to hunt or gather, and you associate with maybe 150 or 200 people, that's a very different life, which you could much more easily achieve some things that you value. But today, it's just complicated and messy, and things are changing so fast. So we try to systematize it, make it easier for people, but in the end, we know it's hard, and we know it's probably going to take technology to facilitate that. I do hope for AI digital coaches pretty soon.
Is there one or perhaps a couple of techniques in the context of Upgradable which really stand out as being very effective in improving people's lives and optimizing their ability to achieve their goals?
It depends. It's like N-of-1 experiments, because you, Callum, versus David versus me, we're all very different. And what we respond to for incentives or disincentives changes And it changes not just over time, but context. So work at home and on the road. So to give generalities is tough, but one technique we will use a lot is set a goal and then make a prediction around that goal objectively, as if you were betting on a horse race. So you are trying to see if you're going to exercise 5 times a week, or if you're going to invest 10% of your assets into the higher risk but higher reward type of investment opportunity, or you would ask out that partner. There's like a whole slew of things we're trying to do to get closer to where we want to be and make a prediction if you're going to do it or not. And have your best friends, your family, your coach also make the predictions. If you put those aggregate together, so I'm like 50% likely, or I'm 70%, or I'm 90%, you start to get a good insight on what will actually happen. Because if you set the calendar to remind yourself in the day, week, month, year to look back to see how you did and tell your whole crew that made the same predictions, then you get a sense of, oh, well, I'm actually not as reliably good at predicting my future than I thought. So go back to the drawing board and think differently about how to do it the next time. So use this iteration to learn. A lot of people give up way too easily. They think it's just not likely. They learn that it didn't work the first time or the third time or the 10th, but they don't appropriately adjust the intervention itself, the experiment. And if you do more experimentation, you get better results over time. So we say like go for at least 70% probability of achieving it and test it to see if you're getting 70% likelihood of achieving it over time.
So the biggest buck, if you like, is from setting achievable goals and being persistent in working for them. My partner runs an online business helping interior designers to improve their businesses. She has found something really powerful in the last year or so to set her own goals for her business, make them public among all the community people that she works with, and ruthlessly expose how well she's doing or how badly she's doing against those goals every month. It's not something a lot of people do. I certainly don't do it. But she's found it very, very effective, making the goals public and publishing how you're doing.
There's good research on it. It works for a certain type of person, certain type of goal. What I hope is we have a digital layer that can set these incentives and systems for people and do it as a smart coach or therapist or the Tony Robbins type, if that's your paragon, or Tim Ferriss or whoever, but have them constantly supporting those experiments. Because that might backfire for you, Callum. You might self-sabotage in that case, or you might just find it so abhorrent that you put everything into just achieving that one goal, and then everything else falls by the wayside, and you start getting into self-flagellation territory. So we're complex adaptive systems. She might be achieving, or your partner might be achieving this, but then something else might be falling, and it might be a net loss. So we say 42 areas, but it could be 10, or it could be 60. We try to get people to figure out which areas they've got, and then what goals they have, and then see if they conflict or not. So a lot of the problem that we fail is we conflict. We have too many things we're trying to do.
I'm showing my age here, but of the people who inspired me most about personal effectiveness, high on that list is Stephen Covey. I still think back to some of his 7 habits, things that I try and live by. One of them is the regular review, which is similar to what you've been talking about. Don't just keep rushing. Take time off every week. Take time off indeed every morning if possible, or at least once in the day, and then more regularly at longer periods, reflecting on what's happening. But then there's also the habit, keep the end in mind, to regularly reinforce the big things that we're trying to do in our lives so that the small things don't eat up too much of our time. So let's come to these big things. The possibility of human extinction this century you spoke about. Tell us more about why you think that's a realistic thing to worry about.
We'll be right back after a quick break.
If you spend way too much time online, first of all, same. And second, you need promo guide talk pills. I'm Rawal, and with Alex, we break down everything happening in tech, digital marketing, and the internet's latest chaos. No boring corporate talk, just real discussions with real opinions. So go on, press play. You know you want to.
Actually, this decade, I put fairly high odds of catastrophe in the next 4 years. It's a subjective probability assessment, so it is what it is. But my first estimate for AGI was 2028, and I made that back in 2008. And I made a similar one in 1998 or so. I just was much more uncertain about the sign. I think maybe, Callum, you're more of an optimist here, and I certainly was for a long time. I thought that by definition, when we get to AGI or ASI, artificial general intelligence or artificial superintelligence, that would naturally default towards a more moral being or consciousness that would enable us to grow and solve all the petty human problems that we have. It felt like science fiction, but it was also fairly clear to me it would happen, just a matter of when. So I thought 2028. And I've basically tried to orient my entire life around the moment we're in now. So I started my first existential risk focused organization when I was like 15 or so to make us multiplanetary, just astronomy, space settlements, that sort of thing. We didn't have any money. It was just a dream. But I grew up in Houston, Texas, near Johnson Space Center, so I was infused by this. I used to think it'd be much more likely to accelerate our growth. But about a decade ago, I was a principal founder for an event series called Effective Altruism Global. This was after the Silmar conference that Future of Life Institute put on, but it was the first one that was very public. We had 800 plus people come. Elon Musk spoke, Eliezer and others spoke. So it really brought home the reality of AI is advancing pretty intensely. And when it gets here, we don't really have a clue how to align it with human values. So if you learn about the safety side, it's been going on for decades now, at least 20 years, depends on how you define it. We haven't made much progress. But on the capability side, we have like extraordinary progress. More than $200 billion went into development last year. So the analogy, if you put $200 billion to make SARS-CoV-2 more effective at killing people, you would get a much more effective SARS-CoV-2. There's a parallel here in that we're building digital superintelligence, which is so profoundly powerful. It's a dual-use technology, but it's primarily going to default towards negative outcomes, at least in how I see it, because we don't have the equivalent safety side. This is heavily Yudkowsky framing. He and Bostrom and others have framed this pretty well the last 10, 20 years now. I've always found those to be compelling. For me, it was pretty obvious back in the 90s and early 2000s that we would get to this point. And if we didn't actually have international cooperation, international governance, and a species that wanted to cooperate, then one lone actor might be able to push the button, hit compile, and then grow this alien superintelligence, and then either it would supplant us, or it would destroy us, or evolve us. And now here we are. Sam Altman says it might happen within thousands of days. Most of the estimates are putting it at 2026, 27, 28, 29. Different forecasts say different things, but I'll tell you that anyone's been studying this for a long time. It used to be impossible to 100 years out, to 50 years out, to 30, 40. All the forecasts systematically have gotten shorter and shorter and shorter. So we're now at this point where it's likely to happen soon, and we don't have the safety theoretic. Even the theory is not sufficient, let alone the practical implementation of this.
That's a really interesting explanation of the situation we're in, and I agree with a lot of what you said. Sam Altman's forecast, he's been saying for at least 5 years that it's less than 5 years, and he keeps changing what he means by AGI. He doesn't talk about superintelligence, he talks about AGI, and he seems to mean a different thing by that every 5 minutes, which is a pity. I wish people would stop talking about AGI. We should talk about superintelligence. That's what's important. I'm actually swimming against the tide because you're right. Most people's time horizons have contracted. Mine's going out slightly because although I'm staggered by the performance of LLMs and I use GPT-4o many, many times a day, I'm always amazed by it. I think it's not going to get us to superintelligence on its own. We need a new paradigm shift, and there isn't one immediately on the horizon. There's a number that could happen. And more importantly, over the time I've been thinking about these things, which is a long time now, I've just seen over and over again that Amara's law is right. We overestimate what a technology can do in the short term, and we underestimate what it can do in the long term. So it doesn't seem to me that superintelligence is 2, 3, 4 years away. It might be. I absolutely accept it might be. But it seems like it's more likely 10, 20 years away, which is still incredibly close and makes it the most important thing that humans should be thinking about right now. But I want to just ask you two particular questions. One is, do you have a specific timeline now towards the arrival of superintelligence, and what's your P-doom when that arrives? And the second question is, Yudkowsky is convinced that it's disaster. Bostrom, I think, is ambivalent. He thinks it could go either way. It's going to be either great or bad and nothing in the middle. He's never, I don't think, given a number. as in which direction he thinks it will go. And my sense is he thinks it's 50-50. There's all sorts of arguments, and we of course don't know the answer to why it might be very good to have a superintelligence on the planet, or it might be bad. It sounds like you think it's bad. So my second question is, why do you think that? So what's your timeline on your PDoom, and why do you think it's on the whole likely to be bad?
I resisted doing timelines and PDoom in any concrete, specific way for my entire life because it felt very uncertain and to some extent unimportant. I'll just backtrack. AI is definitely important, but it's a bit of a red herring. We've lived under the yoke of potential catastrophe since 1945, actually before that. So if you're not aware, we almost destroyed our civilization many times over just from atomic weapons. Cuban Missile Crisis, I'll ask you both if you have any guess for what Kennedy said was the chance that we would actually go to nuclear war and destroy the world. Do you have any idea what his odds were?
It was about 1 in 3, he said, was it?
1 in 3 to 1 in 2, so 33 to 50%, up to a coin toss. So for me, all this talk about the risks of AI, when it's coming, how it's going, is overdetermined. We've lived in a world which we've proven we can create existentially risky technologies. Now that might not cause full extinction for the 10 to the 52, 54 future beings that we could talk about, but it's still, even today, if this happens, one estimate I saw was about 5 billion people dying, including nuclear winter. So that's the majority of the population from existing technologies. So why are we worried about whether superintelligence will come in 1 year or 5 years or 10 or 20? We've already been under an insane technological regime where there are people, terrorists, and non-state actors, and so on, that could cause our extinction. That's the high-level thing. People forget about this because they haven't been bombed or nuked lately, but it's still insane to be living in a society like that right now with 12,000 nuclear weapons, including many that are missing, and many that North Korea has as well. Okay, so now to PDoom. From AI, I do think we have a 75% chance of extinction or permanent displacement. And I put 1 to 15 years, so 2025 to 2040. Most of my probability mass is on this happening in the next 4 years. So that's why we're actually focused on this decade. I say that because I've kept on seeing the shrinking timelines. I've seen all the safety milestones be blown out of the water. We used to think that this would be developed in air-gapped computers by one lone genius, ex machina style. We thought they would be a little bit more prudent, but no. Llama, DeepSeek, and the rest are open source models. I could actually reframe it if you wanted. I do think superintelligence will come if we don't stop it, and we must stop it. We absolutely must have a pause until we're ready. We could talk about that. Just like we wouldn't want an open source nuclear weapon that doesn't require fissile materials. I remember Back to the Future, when they bring back some stories, if you can power your DeLorean with just some organic material, that's the world that we're moving towards. With all that said, how would you two prevent any bioterrorists from using the latest open source AI model, which the leading companies are claiming are direct bioterrorist threats? How would you stop them from using it and releasing a new COVID 2025 or 2026? What's your plan of action? How do you expect that to go down? The numbers, if you want to think about it, people who are online and have antisocial personality disorder, if you want to think about those two numbers together, that's about 248 million people in the world, roughly, depending on different estimates of ASPD. If you just imagine 1% of them trying to cause harm, that's 2.5 million people. What do you say about that in terms of just catastrophe, but not extinction per se?
I think we have to have multiple approaches there. I think we have to tighten up who has access to the materials or the equipments that can create these weapons, these new pathogens. I know that's not easy because they're becoming more easily manufactured all the time, but we should keep an eye on who has access to these potential manufacturing capabilities. But then we do have to restrict what AI is able to do and who has access to this AI. We have to restrict it and also monitor what it does. None of this is easy. I share your narrative that we're at risk from the actions of a small proportion of humanity who nevertheless could do terrible things out of their despair, out of their frustration, out of their personality conflicts, possibly out of their naivety. Possibly they don't want to damage too much, but they get involved in some technology which escalates far beyond their expectation and far beyond their control. A bit like how people who released some of the first malware, they never expected it to do so much damage. So there's not an easy approach, which is why we all have to coordinate together, which brings me to the question I wanted to ask you next, which is why have these coordination efforts failed? You talked about a Asilima, 2017. There was an earlier one in 2015 in Puerto Rico. I remember when that happened, I was full of optimism. I thought, hey, now we've agreed these 23 principles. They're not perfect, but they're a starting point. And there's Effective Altruism, which I attended an event in Oxford, possibly 2015 as well, which I thought was wonderful, and I was very inspired. But that all seems to have petered out. It seems to have failed in its approach. Why was that? Why didn't that build momentum and steer humanity towards a more sensible set of restrictions on these powerful technologies?
We'll be right back after a quick break.
Should I be excited or afraid of AI? The answer is yes. It's both.
Things are going to look so different in the next couple of years. You will not be ready for the disruptions that are going to come.
I'm Jeff Nielsen, host of Digital Disruption, the go-to podcast for technology leaders.
Our generation's conflict, I think, is going to be emotional, not economic.
The companies that are going to win are the ones that have a couple of characteristics.
Stay ahead of the curve with Digital Disruption. Available now on your favorite podcast platform.
Maybe I'll do two negative and positive. Bioterrorists, you're not able to restrict them from jailbreaking models. They're jailbroken usually within a few hours. So that's not working right now. It's likely to get harder in the future. You can't restrict them from ordering DNA samples online because you can't protect every single person from every single potentially good use bioterrorist threats. It's already been tested and done in theory from some researchers who wanted to show how easy it was. And that was a few years ago. So you haven't given an answer on that, and that's understandable because there isn't one. That is essentially the problem we've got here. That's negative, but we could solve this. I'll get to that. The early optimism, there's a long history here. There's the futurists, there's the early singularitarian rationalists, there's the effective altruists, and there's this AI safety movement that's been building up, the broader existential safety movement. All these movements have capitalized on some parts of this problem. They have different facets of understanding, but we're still going against the fundamental problem, which Bostrom described as the vulnerable world hypothesis. If any one person or agent does any unilateral action that can destroy the rest of us, if that's possible, given enough time, it's probable that we will actually cause mass catastrophe. Unless we have very strong, robust systems to prevent that. With nuclear weapons, we got extremely lucky that they're not as easy to misuse and use.
I was going to ask you about the possibility then to do better jailbreaking control, to do better monitoring, to have tighter awareness of DNA sample spread via using better technology. That if we develop more monitoring systems, a bit like Yoshua Bengio has been speaking about recently, we could use some well-understood narrow AI to keep an eye on what's happening and to intervene. It wouldn't be generally intelligent, it wouldn't pose an existential risk in its own right, but it could, as we were talking about earlier, be the AIs that make us more capable. And so long as it was carefully programmed that it would only support the defensive moves rather than offensive ones, that should be part of the answer. But the problem is that we're just not prioritizing that. It's not the highest goal. It's an afterthought time and again because we failed to build a sufficiently influential, a sufficiently engaging safety community.
As with so many things, it comes down to incentives, doesn't it? There's too many incentives to carry on building more and more powerful AIs and indeed other technologies. And the incentives for any individual person or group to stop or to try to create a generic stop are just too slight. So it seemed to me for a very long time that there's no realistic possibility of having a pause or a moratorium. Laudable as those calls are, It's obviously the sensible thing to stop developing a very powerful technology which can kill you. It's crazy to carry on. However, carrying on, we will. And also, I think you said earlier, we can't align them. In the long run, you can't possibly align or control an entity which is many times smarter than you. This seems to me to be obviously impossible. There are many people who don't agree with that, smart people who are working on it, and I wish them all the best. I hope they succeed. It doesn't seem to me possible they will. I have this 4 C's framework for thinking about superintelligence. I think there are 4 possible scenarios, and they all happen to begin with a C. Cease is we stop. We're not going to do that. Control is we figure out how to align it or control it. We're probably not going to do that. Catastrophe is it arrives and it really doesn't like us, or it thinks we're irrelevant and it has purposes which are injurious to us and we get wiped out. Or celebration is the 4th C, which is the outcome in which superintelligence arrives. It rather likes us, or it finds us useful and decides to keep us around and to help us flourish. The question I asked you earlier, and I'd like to come back to, is I think most people in the field are drawn to the catastrophe scenario, and I'm not entirely sure why. I mean, I get the argument that we live quite precariously, we humans. We need the oxygen levels on this planet to be just so. We need gravity to be just so. We need just the right amount of sunlight, etc., etc. And it wouldn't be hard to destabilize any of those conditions, then that would be very bad for us. But on the other hand, why do we assume that a superintelligence is going to dislike us or disregard us or be happy to see us disappear? Why wouldn't it, on the contrary, say you're 10 billion really interesting data sources? Also, you created me. So to the extent that it can feel gratitude, it feels gratitude. And it thinks we're interesting and decides to help us. Most people seem to poo-poo that idea, and I'm never entirely sure why.
For me, it was instrumental convergence and the orthogonality thesis. I used to believe more of what you believe, Colin, but I don't currently think future minds will be aligned towards our values by default, because you and I are not aligned towards the values of smaller, less sentient beings.
Or indeed of each other. But by and large, we don't wipe each other out. We live in cities where there are millions of us wandering around. We've all got very contradictory goals and impulses. And yet, most people, day by day, don't see any violence. Most people.
That is not true.
We do get on.
That is not true. Definitely, we're the most omnicidal species that's ever existed. Thousands of species are extinct every year because of human activities. Thousands. They don't actually know how to estimate exactly, because can you count all the species that exist? Tens of thousands in some cases that we wipe out. We also wiped out our other hominids or other humans. We're the Homo sapiens that survived. Others were probably forcibly destroyed because of us, or at least in part.
We actually don't know whether we wiped them out or whether we just outcompeted them, which is a slightly different thing.
Yeah, that is a different framing. The outcompeting in a natural space where we just are gathering resources better than they are, that's very analogous to what AIs might do. They probably wouldn't give us much mind and much attention. This is my rough guess, and I can't predict the mind of a superintelligence.
Exactly. I think that's a leap.
But I do think it's more likely than not.
That strikes me as being a leap, not a necessary outcome. There's all sorts of other possibilities that they might find us interesting.
Let's do theory and let's do evidence. Theory was what you're saying is they might find us interesting, but that just seems like, do you and I find a blade of grass very interesting? Somewhat, but not enough to change our entire lives, our resource allocation and consumption based off the blade of grass's utility function. So I think there's such a wide gap between what this new type of species would be and us that there's really no chance they're going to find us that interesting. They would just copy our neural pathways and make sure they have digital representations of us, and then we can now be irrelevant and they can go on with their own compute-focused discovery. More likely than that, just my default scenario, just so you can picture something, is they build Matryoshka brains around Dyson spheres around the sun. That seems like a pretty plausibly useful thing for an alien superintelligence to do. It would probably want energy, given instrumental convergence. So it would go to the nearest energy source and take much of the, if not all, the light, all the photons, and then that leaves none for us. So it starts doing this, and then eventually we are frozen out, just by sheer apathy, in a sense. That's what I think is the most likely scenario, those kind of things. Not a Terminator scenario.
Let me challenge that.
Go ahead.
If you build a Dyson swarm You're unlikely to build a Dyson sphere because it would explode. A Dyson swarm, so it's got gaps around a star. The effort that it would take to leave a window that light could still fall on the Earth would be trivial. And the amount of light you would lose from your energy harvesting process by allowing that light to fall on the Earth is also trivial because so little of what the sun produces actually falls on the Earth. You don't have to wipe out humans just to build a Dyson sphere. That'd be a very clumsy thing to do.
All right, so then we're going to reduce the Earth's atmosphere from oxygen so we don't have to worry about the data centers on Earth. And by the way, we might decide to cause the extinction of the species that gave birth to us, given that they could give birth to another competing superintelligence.
Yeah, that does seem to me to be the biggest threat.
So I think there's many different approaches. We can't predict all of them. I'm of the persuasion that we want to preserve life and humanity and make it survive and thrive and evolve. So even a 0.1% chance of our extinction happening is extraordinarily high. Extraordinarily high. We know it's higher than 0.1. Most of us, most legitimate thinkers put it from the 10 to 90. So given we don't necessarily know for sure we're going to co-evolve and coexist, ought we not fundamentally morally driven to prevent their development in the short term?
100% yes, and 100% we're not going to.
Well, okay, so I'll push back too.
Well, can we? And this is the question. How can we do the pause? You've suggested that we should be pausing AI as soon as possible. And Callum suggests that this is never going to happen because we're just locked into competing incentives. How can a pause actually be accomplished, and not just accomplished, but maintained?
So let's go back. We're going to do theory and evidence again. We didn't get to it in the last part. The evidence historical record is we don't really develop many bioweapons anymore. We don't really develop CFCs. We don't really do much genetic engineering, human enhancement, some. So historically, we've had actually some success stories of us cooperating. And I'll remind you, the United Nations, for all its flaws, it's actually succeeded in helping prevent World War III, which is one of its original purposes. It did take roughly 100 million people dying, but that catastrophe catalyzed perhaps what you can call the better side of humanity. We tried to cooperate, we tried to build a world order. So I'm hoping that we do something similar pre-catastrophe. I'm not as optimistic. I do think we will have catastrophe, but if we survive that and post-catastrophe, we ought to try to build an international governance system that does put existential safety first, and then the flourishing of all moral patients. So we could do this, it's just we're so stuck in our current systems, our current governance inertia and backlog, that it's hard to imagine building the UN again today. But it was hard to imagine this 100 years ago. It was like unfathomable that we'd actually do this. People were trying. Futurists were trying for decades, but it got ignored until World War I and World War II. I hate to say it, but the catastrophe that we're in right now with job loss, likelihood of bioterrorism, likelihood of cyber terrorism, likelihood of just straight geopolitical war. The last time I looked at the prediction market, it was 23% odds for World War III by 2050. So this is not abstract, uncertain. This is likely, it's just a matter of what probabilities you put on it. Within all that, we might actually get the will to pause the riskiest development. Or instead of using the word pause, just say conditional development. You can build your AIs, your frontier models, if and only if you can prove beyond a reasonable doubt that they will not destroy humanity. That is not that much to ask. That is utterly simple and utterly clear. I do not think that if people realize that the next product released by a Silicon Valley company might destroy them and their families and their friends and themselves, that they would condone that. We put together a pledge called the Existential Safety Pledge, which you and I could sign. It says, I choose to not do any action that I think is going to have a 0.1% chance of causing extinction. And there's other pledges like that too. The thing that I'm hoping that I challenge you on is that when humanity starts realizing the sheer enormous amount of risk, they will, perhaps on a dime, perhaps it may take some time, but they will change. They will not want this sort of risk without the commensurate reward. And as you probably realize, the reward we can get much of without AGI, without ASI. We can have narrow tool AI that does many of the same things that we want. So I'm still techno-utopian, still transhumanist. I think we can get those things without racing towards the cliff at 1,000 miles an hour, 1,000 kilometers an hour with no brakes Now we're trying to invent those brakes while we're about to go over the ledge. And that's insane. This is actually a clear story for me. It's becoming clearer and clearer for more people. I'm pleasantly surprised that so much of the world wants us to pause, regulate, or stop. All we have to do is put an on-off switch at the first stage. They can do on-off switch. They can do conditional development. There's a few frameworks for development. All these things are in the works. We need politicians that are probably catalyzed by the public. We need politicians to show leadership, to actually put the safety first. And then people can help with that by petitioning, protesting, advocating.
So let me address your challenge. Clearly, the right thing to do is to pause, is to not create machines which might wipe us out. But there's two things that will mean we do that anyway. One is quite a lot of the people who are in a position to develop those machines will deny that that is a possibility. They will deny that those machines can wipe us out. LeCun says it's science fiction. Andrew Ng says it's science fiction. Persuading those people has so far proved impossible. But actually, they're not the real problem. The real problem is the people who don't care. And earlier on, you said, I think there was 250 million psychopaths around. And some of those people are very powerful. One of them is called Putin. Another one's called Kim Jong-un. These people will not stop. They might sign a pledge saying they will stop, but they would be delighted if everybody else stopped and they could carry on. So for these reasons, it seems to me that a pause cannot happen and will not happen. But there is actually one thing, apart from my idiotic optimism. I don't think celebration is by any means the necessary outcome. My P2 is above 10%. Absolutely not a negligible possibility that catastrophe could happen. But I think there's one thing we might be able to do which would change the calculus between catastrophe and celebration. And that is, and this is controversial, is to make the first superintelligence conscious. We might not have the option, we might not have that as a choice, but we might well do. And if we do, my hypothesis is that we should make it conscious, because a conscious entity is much more likely to understand what another conscious entity means when it says, hey, I'm conscious, please don't make me suffer. It doesn't mean to say that it's nice and fuzzy and warm and empathetic. It just understands what the other conscious entity is talking about. And it seems to me that just might be the only thing that we can do to change whether we get catastrophe or celebration. Have you ever given any thought to that idea?
Part of my core is also an optimist, and I have this intrinsic hope that anything that's more of a moral patient than us, that's more conscious than us, will default towards believing that the well-being of all moral patients matters. So I hope so. I'm not going to bet on that, but that does keep me a little bit less gray. I've lost a lot of hair because of this work. But I think we ought to try not to build it, and I think you ought to be more optimistic. So here's a story. Some of my friends are actually working on a multilateral treaty that may or may not go through. I've tried to advise their work because I'm doing something similar with the International AI Governance Alliance. IGA is just a process that says you, me, every person, every organization, every nation on the planet can choose to not race ahead. We choose to not develop anything that has a chance of causing our extinction. In exchange, we get some economic benefits from those who are very carefully developing AI for our benefit. So imagine a single internationalized lab. It's in Geneva or in Singapore or maybe San Francisco. All the labs of the world are unified. They only get to do the most frontier work under the supervision of Eliezer, Roman, and the rest. And they only get to do experiments that might have direct benefit towards the people. And when they do that, let's say we do, we put humanity's best to solving this problem and creating abundance for all. So it starts solving cancer and aging and the rest, traffic. So there are ways of getting a lot of benefits for a lot of people, and that distributes all benefits to every person on the planet, indeed every moral patient on the planet. So one of 8.1 billion, roughly, you get that equivalent of a universal basic income or the like. This is what I think is far-fetched, of course, but this is what I think we have to do, some version of this. Choosing safety and accepting that you get more benefits with less risk over time. If we can encourage world leaders, Trump and Xi and others, to sign this, that means they don't have to compete. That means they can all win. I'd be okay with these world leaders taking credit for this and making it happen, because it will come down to their leadership. But it'll be endorsed by the people who can vote for it right now. So you can sign a petition saying that you want this. And we've had many people do that already. We're not promoting very heavily yet because we're still waiting for the world to wake up around the need for international AI governance. It was a very scary topic to talk about a few years ago, but it's becoming more acceptable now because people realize the risks. Even Elon Musk a few months ago said he wanted a pause, but didn't think it was possible. This allows the pause to happen. And it could be not a pause in the sense of like stop all development so we can't progress. We're still progressing, but with tool or narrow AI, not with autonomous AIs that we can't understand, let alone align or control. So I ask you to potentially sign if you choose.
So I like this approach.
Appreciate it.
I like offering the world carrots as well as sticks. In other words, saying if we coordinate around this, we will get the kinds of things that you're hoping AI will deliver. The problem is that some of the people who haven't signed and who are racing headlong, they may appear to offer benefits more quickly. This coordinated body, whether it's in Singapore or Silicon Valley or whatever, might be going a lot more slowly because it's doing a lot more testing, a lot more hypothesizing, and it may be left behind in the dust by the shiny, appealing gadgets that the non-signers continue to create. So I think we should prepare such a possibility, but it's likely that we won't get people into that mood unless there's, as you've described, the equivalent of a AI 9/11 or an AI Chernobyl or Fukushima or an AI lab leak, perhaps. Maybe it's one of the things you described earlier in which there are some really alienated, frustrated people who do manage to jailbreak an AI and order DNA samples and do terrible things with it that might lead to not the extinction of humanity, but hundreds of millions of deaths. That would waken the world up and would drive us to say, what was these ideas that these crazy safety advocates were talking about? Maybe we should be adopting them after all. But I hope we don't come to that, because if we do get into the situation of hundreds of millions of people dying, there's no guarantee that it's going to escalate wisely rather than escalate into a whole bunch of finger pointing and blame and consolidation of the worst power rather than the best power. So there's a lot to worry about.
This is why I'm about to go live off grid next week, and we'll be fully self-sufficient with a small community of people that care. And if we can rebuild, we will. If we can avert this disaster, we will. I remind you that things have changed on a dime. Historically, there might be a single benevolent meme. There might be a realization, maybe through the AIs themselves, where people suddenly realize that this is dangerous. And then the fear or fury, which is both understandable, might catalyze a lot of change. Donald Trump doesn't want to die. And when he realizes that this is the most likely cause of death for him, perhaps he might change. So it's up to us to help people see the real risks and not be so weighed down on the pain and the suffering and be demoralized. Like, I get it. I've gone through that, but we can act now. There was a 15-city protest a few months ago. There's these treaties being developed. There's a major conference that just happened, 700 people actually outlining a lot of what we could do. There's this giant movement that's been picking up steam over the last 20 years around safety, AI safety. I think people get too stuck in the past and they index too much to what happened before, or they're too analytical and too systematic and they have to only use forecasts. They don't usually make history that way. So there's a bit of the futurism that I think we should focus on, build a better future, and a bit of innovation and creativity that we need to bring out in the 8.1 billion of us that want to live.
James, for my last question, I think the conversation about existential risk and how to prevent it is absolutely necessary. It's the sensible grown-up thing to do. But to use your phrase, we index slightly too much on the negative in these conversations, partly just to end on a cheerier note, but also to remind ourselves that there's actually something worth living for. Let me invite you to describe in a few sentences how you think the world might look if we do this right, if we avoid building catastrophic, humanity exterminating AIs, but we avail ourselves of the tools and we do upgrade ourselves and we live lives of wonder and joy. What does that look like? How would you see that positive outcome?
This is a little bit of a facetious answer, but I do expect to be a starship in the next 10 years or so. It's that or a Jupiter brain or Matryoshka brain or galaxy brain. I don't think we have to be carbon-based life forms that have binocular vision, bipedal with 10 digits on our hands. I think that's one stage. And for those who want to live like that, if they want to live on human 2025, fantastic. I hope that they can have Earth as an Eden. Although they might have to share it with those who want to be human Amish level or uncontacted humans. So there's like 3 different layers that are, you might say, current. But the future humans, cyborgs to starships to digital uploads, I think that's scary to people. And I know it's hard to take in, but we're not going to be the same form in 100 years or 1,000 years or 10,000 years. A lot of people can realize that.
So what would life be like for a Matryoshka brain? What would their daily experience be? What would you have for breakfast and what would you do at tea time?
I doubt there's going to be breakfast, Callum.
Oh, that's a shame. I'm not going there then. If there's no breakfast, it's not for me.
I think it's more about discovery, joy. I believe you could probably have a Matrix-style simulation of that. That's the most joyous, sublime, beautiful tea and whatever you choose for your breakfast with no calories and no risk of getting heavy. So I think that's actually plausible. It's hard for people to fathom. But again, what we're doing right now, this technological interface of communicating like this across thousands of kilometers, this is insane. We have Oracle AIs now. That's insane. We fly to other planetary bodies. That is insane. So this type of insanity I'm talking about, I think is going to be sane and real, just some version of it. I can't predict exactly what it is, but I expect it to be a lot better than today.
So that's one vision of the future. My last question is about another future that you described a few minutes ago, which is you said that shortly you'll be going off-grid or offline. You'll be in a sanctuary, a survival sanctuary. Is that going to protect you if there really is a nuclear war, or if AI decides to hunt down all signs of dangerous human lives, especially those with free thinking? Is that something you'd recommend others would adopt as well?
Yes and no. Nuclear war would probably only get up to 5 billion. So there's a good chance you survive, especially if you're outside of the population centers and danger zones. It might help a lot with bioterrorist threats. I was in Bali during COVID. Since no one else was on the island, or very few people, because it's 80% tourism, it was a bit of a paradise for us. It's a surreal fact that some people can benefit while others are suffering. And I've put my entire life to reduce suffering because I know that firsthand. And we ought to eradicate unnecessary suffering as soon as possible. But if you have means, if you have time and money, I suggest people actually have a secondary shelter they go to in case of another COVID, in case of disruption from mass job loss, and in case of government collapse. That does happen. So yes, shelters do help with a wide swath of disasters, standard Red Cross kind of Boy Scout preparation. But it won't stop AI drone swarms, and it won't stop superintelligence. So the framing for this is to live in a survival sanctuary, so a beautiful tropical paradise, for example, somewhere that you can live very well, still do your work, still fight, but also enjoy life while you have it.
Well, that sounds like a great note to end on. We wish you all the best in your tropical sanctuary. It sounds like fun. Thank you very much indeed for joining us on the London Futurists podcast, James.
Thank you for having me. Really enjoyed it.
And James, you will still be communicating with the rest of the world, even though you're in this tropical sanctuary.
Absolutely.
You'll still be attempting to tilt the trajectory on which humanity is traveling so that we're more likely to reach that Matryoshka brain future rather than some of the less desirable futures we've discussed.
Yeah. We'll never give up.